The new teacher at Cedarwood High. It was the beginning of a new school year at Cedarwood High, and the halls were filled with excitement. New faces were arriving, and students were eager to meet their teachers. Among them was Mrs. Anderson, a new English teacher who was about to start her first day of the school. She had moved to Cedarwood from a different city, hoping to make a fresh start in her teaching career. Mrs. Anderson was a black woman, confident and proud of her work. She had spent years in education, shaping young minds and inspiring her students. Her passion for teaching was evident in everything she did. She believed in fairness, equality, and most importantly, in showing love and respect to all her students. When Mrs. Anderson first arrived at Cedarwood High, she was welcomed with open arms by most of the staff. The teachers and staff members seemed friendly, and she felt optimistic about her new job. Everything seemed perfect, and she was excited to begin. But there was one person who didn't seem as welcoming. The principal, Mr. Johnson, was a man who had been at Cedarwood High for years. He was known for his strict rules and high expectations. He had a reputation for being tough on his staff and students, but no one ever questioned his authority. Mrs. Anderson had heard a little about him before joining the school, but she hadn't met him yet. Her first meeting with Mr. Johnson was scheduled for the morning of her first day. As she walked into his office, she noticed how cold and formal he was. Mr. Johnson barely looked up from his desk when Mrs. Anderson entered. His stern expression made her feel uneasy, but she did her best to stay calm. "Mrs. Anderson, I hope you're ready for the year ahead," he said, his voice deep and flat. "I'm excited to be here, Mr. Johnson," she replied with a smile, hoping to make a good impression. He nodded but didn't return her smile. Instead, he quickly went over the rules of the school, focusing on the things he expected from his teachers. Mrs. Anderson listened carefully, noting how he seemed to stress discipline and order. There was no mention of encouragement or support for the teachers. It was clear that Mr. Johnson ran the school with an iron fist. As the meeting continued, Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mr. Johnson didn't seem interested in getting to know her or her teaching style. Instead, he made a few pointed comments about her appearance and the way she carried herself. "You'll need to be careful, Mrs. Anderson," he said, narrowing his eyes. "This school has a certain way of doing things. If you can't fit in, things might get difficult for you." Mrs. Anderson was taken aback. She had never been warned like this before. She was used to schools that welcomed new ideas and fresh approaches, but something about Mr. Johnson's words felt like a warning, not advice. After the meeting, Mrs. Anderson couldn't help but feel uneasy. She walked out of Mr. Johnson's office and took a deep breath. She had been excited to start, but now doubts began to creep in. She told herself that she would not let one man's attitude ruin her enthusiasm. She was a professional, and she had a job to do. When Mrs. Anderson walked into her classroom for the first time, she felt a rush of relief. The room was bright and welcoming, filled with desks, books, and colorful posters. It was everything she wanted in a teaching space. She quickly unpacked her things and set up her desk, determined to make the best of her new role. The students began to arrive soon after. Mrs. Anderson greeted each of them with a smile, introducing herself and getting to know them a little. Most of the students seemed excited to have a new teacher, and she felt a connection with them right away. However, as the day went on, Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The first few days passed in a blur of lesson plans, meetings, and student interactions. Mrs. Anderson was doing her best to keep up with the fast pace of the school. She worked hard to prepare lessons that would inspire her students, but she also began to notice small things that bothered her. Mr. Johnson would occasionally visit her classroom, standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed, watching her teach. He never gave any feedback, good or bad. Instead, he would just stare at her, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. Mrs. Anderson tried not to let it bother her, but it was hard not to feel like she was being judged. By the end of the week, the tension was starting to build. Mrs. Anderson was doing her best to stay positive, but she couldn't ignore the fact that Mr. Johnson seemed to be focusing on her more than the other teachers. She heard whispers in the hallway, and some of her colleagues gave her worried looks. It was becoming clear that things were not as easy as they seemed. What Mrs. Anderson didn't know was that Mr. Johnson had a history of being difficult with certain teachers, particularly those who didn't fit into his rigid way of doing things. Mrs. Anderson was about to learn just how far he would go to maintain control over his school, and just how much he would try to push her around. But one thing was for sure. Mrs. Anderson wasn't going to back down. She had faced challenges before, and she wasn't about to let one man ruin her dream job. She would stand her ground and do everything she could to help her students succeed, no matter what Mr. Johnson tried. Suspense hook. Little did she know, Mr. Johnson was about to take things to a whole new level, and Mrs. Anderson's life at Cedarwood High was about to change forever. The hidden tension. As the days passed, Mrs. Anderson continued to pour herself into her work, determined to make a difference in her students' lives. She loved teaching, and every lesson she prepared was crafted with care. But the unease she felt around Principal Johnson was becoming harder to ignore. He continued to visit her classroom, often without warning. Every time he walked in, Mrs. Anderson's heart would race, and the atmosphere would shift. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and despite her best efforts to carry on as usual, it was hard to stay focused when he was silently observing her. He never offered praise or even a word of encouragement. Instead, he simply watched, his arms crossed, his eyes sharp and cold. Her students noticed it too. One afternoon, while Mrs. Anderson was teaching a lesson about classic literature, one of her students, Judah, raised her hand. "Miss Anderson, why does Principal Johnson always look at you like that?" she asked, a puzzled expression on her face. Mrs. Anderson paused for a moment. She didn't want to discuss it in front of the class, but she couldn't ignore the question. "He's just making sure everything is going well, Jada," she answered with a smile. "But don't worry about him. Focus on your studies." Even though she tried to brush it off, the question stayed in her mind. Why was Mr. Johnson so focused on her? And why did he seem to be looking for something to criticize? She had worked at other schools before, and never had a principal been so concerned with her every move. There was something about Cedarwood High that was different, something that made her feel like an outsider. Things took an even stranger turn when she overheard a conversation between two teachers in the staff lounge. They were discussing the school's history and how the previous principal had been very strict. Mrs. Anderson knew that Mr. Johnson had taken over after the last principal retired, but what she didn't know was that his leadership style was often harsh, especially when it came to certain teachers. "I heard he's been giving new teachers a hard time," one teacher whispered. "He doesn't like anyone rocking the boat. He wants complete control over everything. And if he doesn't like you, he'll make your life difficult." Mrs. Anderson's stomach churned. Could this be true? Was Mr. Johnson targeting her for some reason? She hadn't done anything to upset him. She was just trying to teach and help her students. But it seemed like every time he visited her classroom, he was looking for something to criticize. It wasn't just the occasional visit either. His presence had started to feel like a constant weight on her shoulders. That afternoon, after her last class, Mrs. Anderson made her way to the staff lounge to grab a quick cup of coffee before heading home. As she entered, she saw Principal Johnson standing near the coffee machine, talking to another teacher. When he saw Mrs. Anderson, his eyes flicked toward her, and for a brief moment, he looked almost surprised. "Ms. Anderson," he said in his usual flat tone, "I trust everything is going smoothly in your classroom." Mrs. Anderson nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, Principal Johnson. Everything is going well. The students are engaged, and we're making good progress." He studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge her response. Then, without warning, he said, "I noticed you've been incorporating a lot of new methods in your teaching. Are you sure that's the best approach for these students? We have a certain way of doing things here." His words were like a slap to the face. Mrs. Anderson had always prided herself on being adaptable and creative with her teaching methods. But here was the principal, questioning her professionalism in front of other staff members. It was clear he wasn't interested in hearing her side of things. "I believe that every student learns differently, and it's important to find approaches that work for them," she replied, keeping her voice calm and steady. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He simply turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Mrs. Anderson standing there, feeling small and frustrated. The tension between them was growing, and Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. She had no idea why Mr. Johnson seemed to have a personal vendetta against her, but she was beginning to feel like she was being watched at every turn. The escalating tension. The next few days at Cedarwood High felt increasingly unbearable for Mrs. Anderson. Each time she walked into her classroom, she could almost feel Principal Johnson's eyes on her, lurking just outside her door. The pressure was mounting, but she tried her best to stay focused on her students, knowing that they depended on her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were slowly spiraling out of control. One afternoon, as Mrs. Anderson was setting up for her lesson, she received a surprise visit from one of the senior teachers, Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper had been at the school for years, and Mrs. Anderson respected her deeply. She was a no-nonsense teacher with a wealth of experience. "Ms. Anderson, may I have a word?" Mrs. Harper asked as she stepped inside, her voice low and serious. "Of course, Mrs. Harper," Mrs. Anderson replied, setting her lesson materials down on the desk. Mrs. Harper glanced around the room before closing the door behind her. Her face was grim. "I've noticed the tension between you and Principal Johnson. It's not just in your classroom. I can feel it too. What's going on?" Mrs. Anderson sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know. I'm doing everything I can to be a good teacher, but it feels like he's watching me all the time. He doesn't seem to like the way I'm teaching, and it's starting to affect everything." Mrs. Harper looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "I hate to say this, but it's not just about your teaching. He's been targeting new teachers for a while now. There's something personal going on, and I've seen it before." Mrs. Anderson frowned, confused. "Personal? What do you mean?" "Principal Johnson has a way of picking out teachers he doesn't approve of," Mrs. Harper explained, her voice lowering even further. "But here's the thing. He's not as untouchable as he thinks he is. There are some things about him that I've seen over the years that you should know." Before Mrs. Anderson could respond, the bell rang, signaling the start of class. Mrs. Harper gave her a solemn look before quickly heading for the door. "Just be careful, Ms. Anderson. Watch your back. Not everything is as it seems at Cedarwood." Mrs. Anderson stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Mrs. Harper's warning sinking in. She didn't know what exactly she was dealing with, but she knew one thing. Principal Johnson wasn't just a strict leader. There was something more to his behavior. That afternoon, as Mrs. Anderson walked the halls after class, she saw Principal Johnson standing by the teacher's lounge. He was speaking with a group of teachers, but as soon as he saw her, he gave her a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Anderson," he called, his voice smooth, but there was a cold edge to it. "I'd like to have a chat with you. In my office." Mrs. Anderson's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew it couldn't be good. She walked toward his office, her mind racing. What was he going to say this time? Was he going to criticize her teaching again, or was it something worse? When they reached the principal's office, he gestured for her to sit. She took a seat, her hands clenched in her lap, waiting for him to speak. "I've been reviewing your performance, Ms. Anderson," he began, his tone measured. "And I must say, I'm not impressed. You've been incorporating too many unconventional methods into your lessons. The students are confused, and it's affecting their overall progress." Mrs. Anderson's breath caught in her throat. She had been working so hard to find new ways to engage her students, to make learning exciting. To hear him dismiss her efforts so coldly stung. "I believe in a more traditional approach," Principal Johnson continued, his voice sharp, "And I expect all my teachers to adhere to that. We can't afford to experiment with these kids' futures." Mrs. Anderson's mind raced. She wanted to respond, to explain that the students were benefiting from her methods, but something in Principal Johnson's eyes told her it wouldn't make a difference. His mind was made up, and he seemed determined to break her. Suddenly, a thought crossed Mrs. Anderson's mind. What if this wasn't just about teaching styles? What if it was personal? She recalled the tension Mrs. Harper had mentioned, the unspoken words. Was there more to Principal Johnson's behavior than she realized? "I'll make the necessary adjustments," Mrs. Anderson said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I want to make it clear that I'm here for the students, and I'll do whatever it takes to help them succeed." Principal Johnson gave her a tight smile, standing up and walking toward the door. "I'm sure you'll do better, Ms. Anderson, but just know that I'll be keeping a very close eye on you. You'd better fall in line, or there will be consequences." As she left his office, Mrs. Anderson felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The threat in his words was unmistakable. She had no idea what Principal Johnson was capable of, but she knew one thing. He was not going to back down, and neither would she. But little did she know, this was just the beginning. The true power struggle between them was about to escalate, and Mrs. Anderson's world was about to be flipped upside down in a way she never expected. Suspense hook. As Mrs. Anderson left the school that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking beneath the surface, and when she least expected it, she would learn a shocking truth that would change everything. The hidden truth. The next few days felt like a pressure cooker at Cedarwood High. Mrs. Anderson could feel the eyes of Principal Johnson on her every move. He had been observing her classrooms with growing intensity, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was only a matter of time before he found another reason to undermine her. But Mrs. Anderson wasn't the type to back down. She had come to Cedarwood with a passion for teaching, and she wasn't going to let a single person take that away from her, no matter how intimidating they might be. One afternoon, as she was walking to her car after a long day of teaching, Mrs. Anderson was startled when she heard a voice call her name. "Ms. Anderson, wait up." Turning around, she saw Mrs. Harper hurrying toward her. The older teacher had a serious look on her face, one that immediately caught Mrs. Anderson's attention. "What's going on, Mrs. Harper?" Mrs. Anderson asked, a little concerned. "I need to talk to you, and it's important," Mrs. Harper said, her voice low. She glanced over her shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. "Meet me at the coffee shop in 10 minutes. I have some information you need to hear." Mrs. Anderson's heart raced. What could Mrs. Harper have to say that was so urgent? She nodded and agreed to meet her in the coffee shop down the street. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Anderson stepped inside the cozy little cafe. Looking around for Mrs. Harper, she spotted her in a corner booth, her face hidden behind a steaming cup of coffee. As Mrs. Anderson approached, Mrs. Harper looked up, her face drawn and tired. "Thank you for meeting me," Mrs. Harper said, motioning for Mrs. Anderson to sit. "I don't have much time, but I need you to know something. You're in more danger than you think." Mrs. Anderson frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm just trying to do my job." Mrs. Harper sighed deeply. "I know you are, and that's why I'm telling you this. You're not just dealing with a principal who's stuck in his ways. There's more to this than you know. Much more." "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Harper lowered her voice even further. "Principal Johnson isn't just a man with old-fashioned ideas about teaching. He has a history, and it's not a good one. I've seen it before, and I didn't want to believe it. But I've heard things from people who've worked with him in the past." Mrs. Anderson leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What kind of things?" "Things about his temper," Mrs. Harper said, her eyes darting nervously. "There are rumors that he's been involved in some very questionable behavior, especially when it comes to certain teachers. He's not someone you want to mess with, but there's more to it than that." Mrs. Anderson's mind was racing. Could it really be true? Was Principal Johnson capable of something darker than just being the strict, old-fashioned administrator? "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do I do with this information?" "I don't want you to feel alone in this," Mrs. Harper said, her voice sincere. "I've been through something similar with him years ago. It's why I'm so careful now. But I can't just stand by and let him treat you the way he has. You're strong, Ms. Anderson, but don't underestimate what he's capable of. If you push him too hard, things could get ugly." Mrs. Anderson's head was spinning. She had known that Principal Johnson didn't like her, but she hadn't expected this. Could she really take on a man with such a dark reputation? Was she strong enough to fight back? Before Mrs. Anderson could speak, Mrs. Harper stood up quickly, looking over her shoulder. "I have to go now. Be careful. I'll be watching your back, but you need to be ready for what's coming." Mrs. Anderson sat there, still trying to process everything she had just learned. What was she supposed to do now? How could she fight a battle she wasn't even sure she fully understood? As Mrs. Harper left the coffee shop, Mrs. Anderson stared out the window, her mind racing with questions. Was Principal Johnson really the villain everyone was warning her about? Or was he just a strict principal who didn't like change? And more importantly, what was he going to do next? That night, Mrs. Anderson didn't sleep much. The thoughts swirling in her head kept her awake, as she wondered what Principal Johnson's next move would be. She knew one thing for sure: she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Whatever he was planning, she had to be ready for it. The next day, as she walked into school, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had no idea what Principal Johnson would do next, but she wasn't about to let him break her. She was a teacher, and she had a duty to her students. She would stand up for herself and for what was right, no matter what it took. Suspense hook. Little did Mrs. Anderson know, the true test was coming soon, and Principal Johnson was about to show just how far he was willing to go to get rid of her. And what she didn't know was that this battle would not only affect her job, but her family's life as well. The consequences of standing up. The days that followed were tense. Mrs. Anderson arrived at Cedarwood High with a sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Principal Johnson's glare was sharper than usual, and his presence felt heavier, more oppressive. Every time she passed him in the hallway, she could feel his eyes on her, full of judgment and unspoken hostility. She tried her best to focus on her students, but it was becoming more difficult to keep her mind from wandering. The whispers of what Mrs. Harper had told her echoed in her mind. Was Principal Johnson truly capable of something dangerous? Was he trying to force her out of her position? She had to admit, the situation was feeling more like a battleground than a school. That afternoon, she stayed after school to grade papers, hoping to get some quiet work done before going home. The building was mostly empty, save for a few janitors cleaning the hallways and teachers finishing their work. But as Mrs. Anderson worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her classroom. She turned to see Principal Johnson standing in the doorway, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his voice flat. "I need to speak with you." Mrs. Anderson's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment was coming. She stood up slowly, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, Principal Johnson?" she asked, her voice steady, though her insides churned with unease. "I've been receiving complaints about your teaching methods," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Some of your students' parents aren't happy with how you're running your classes. I need you to change your approach." Mrs. Anderson's stomach dropped. This was it, the confrontation she had been dreading. She had always put her students first, always tried to teach in ways that were engaging and effective. The thought of someone undermining her ability to do that filled her with frustration. "What complaints?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the rising anger in her chest. "I haven't received any formal feedback from parents." "That's not for you to know," Principal Johnson replied curtly. Just know that I expect you to adjust. If you don't, you may find yourself in a very difficult position." Mrs. Anderson's mind raced. She had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about teaching methods. It was about something deeper. Principal Johnson wasn't going to stop until he had her out of Cedarwood High. He wanted to make her life miserable, and it seemed like he was willing to do whatever it took. "I'm just doing my job," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice tight with emotion. "I'm here to teach and help my students. I'm not going to change my methods just because someone doesn't like them." Principal Johnson's lips curled into a tight smile. "We'll see about that, won't we?" he said, and with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mrs. Anderson standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. For the rest of the day, Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She knew something wasn't right, and she was growing more certain that Principal Johnson was about to take things further. The next day, when she returned to work, the atmosphere in the school had changed. The air felt thick with tension, and she could sense that everyone around her was on edge. As Mrs. Anderson made her way to her classroom, she was stopped by one of her colleagues, Mr. Hughes, a history teacher who had been at Cedarwood for years. "Hey, Miss Anderson," Mr. Hughes said in a low voice, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure no one could hear. "I don't know if you've noticed, but Principal Johnson is ramping up the pressure on you. He's been telling people he's planning to observe your classes more closely." Mrs. Anderson's stomach sank. This was it. The pressure was mounting, and she knew it was only a matter of time before she'd be forced into a corner. She didn't have much time before the inevitable confrontation, but she was determined not to back down. "I'll be fine, Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the tension in her muscles. "But thank you for the warning." She couldn't help but wonder, though, just how far Principal Johnson was willing to push her, and what would happen if she didn't bend to his demands. The day dragged on, and by the time the final bell rang, Mrs. Anderson felt emotionally exhausted. As she packed up her things and prepared to leave for the day, she received a text message that sent a chill down her spine. It was from her husband, Officer Matthews. "Just heard some things. Be careful tomorrow. Johnson is planning something big." Her heart raced as she read the message again. What did Officer Matthews mean by something big? Was Principal Johnson really taking things that far? Or was there something else going on that Mrs. Anderson didn't know about? As she walked out of the school building, she glanced back at the tall structure, feeling like it was a fortress closing in around her. She had no idea what Principal Johnson was planning next, but she was certain of one thing. This battle was far from over. Suspense hook. Mrs. Anderson was about to face the toughest decision of her career, one that would test not just her teaching abilities, but her entire future at Cedarwood High. What would Principal Johnson do next, and how far was he willing to go to break her? The unseen threat. The following morning, Mrs. Anderson arrived at school early, her mind swirling with worry. The text from Officer Matthews echoed in her head. Johnson is planning something big. She didn't know what that big thing was, but it couldn't be good. The tension in the school was palpable, and Mrs. Anderson could feel it pressing down on her chest as soon as she stepped inside. As she walked down the hallway to her classroom, she noticed the whispers, the eyes that followed her. Her colleagues, who had once greeted her with smiles and friendly words, now gave her wary glances. She felt the weight of their silence, as if they knew something she didn't. Principal Johnson had been stepping up his tactics over the past few days. The rumors had started to spread like wildfire. Parents had complained about her teaching methods, and now he was planning to observe her every move. She had been expecting him to pop in at any moment, but today, the air felt different, more oppressive. Mrs. Anderson settled into her classroom, trying to prepare herself for the day. She reviewed her lesson plan, trying to stay focused, but her thoughts kept drifting to the message from her husband. Was Principal Johnson planning something that would hurt her career, or was there a deeper, more dangerous motive behind his actions? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't let it distract her. Her students needed her. As the bell rang, signaling the start of her first class, she forced herself to push the fear aside and focus on the students who had already started filtering into the room. The lesson began, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. But then, just as she was explaining a concept on the board, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew who it was without even looking. It was Principal Johnson. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like a storm approaching. Mrs. Anderson's mind raced. Was he coming to observe her today? Was he finally going to pull the trigger on whatever plan he had in store? She glanced toward the door just as he appeared in the doorway, his cold gaze locking onto hers. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his voice smooth but laced with tension. "I'd like to speak with you. Now." The students in the room fell silent, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Mrs. Anderson stood still, trying not to let her nerves show. She nodded, giving the class a small, reassuring smile before turning her attention back to the principal. "Of course, Principal Johnson," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. She didn't have a choice. She had to go with him. She couldn't risk making a scene. As they stepped out into the hallway, Mrs. Anderson could feel the weight of the eyes on her, both from her students and the faculty who had gathered nearby. It was as if the entire school was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Principal Johnson led her down the hallway, away from her classroom, and toward the administrative offices. Mrs. Anderson could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of something dark and dangerous hovering just beneath the surface. When they reached the principal's office, he gestured for her to sit. Mrs. Anderson sat across from him, trying to keep her composure. She had no idea what he was about to do, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. "You've been warned, Mrs. Anderson," Principal Johnson began, his tone colder than ever. "Your teaching methods are causing problems, and the complaints are growing. You either change your approach, or we'll have to take more drastic action." Mrs. Anderson clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. She had expected this. He had been threatening her for days now, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. The fear, the anger, the frustration, all of it bubbled to the surface, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm not going to change who I am as a teacher," she said firmly. "I will always do what's best for my students, and if that means challenging the system, then so be it." Principal Johnson's eyes narrowed, his lips twisting into a mocking smile. "You'll regret that decision," he said. "I don't take kindly to people who defy me." Before Mrs. Anderson could respond, the door to the office opened, and a familiar voice called out, "Is everything okay in here?" It was Mrs. Harper, the other teacher who had been giving Mrs. Anderson advice over the past few weeks. Mrs. Anderson's eyes flicked to Mrs. Harper, who stood in the doorway with a concerned expression. She knew something was off, and she wasn't about to let Principal Johnson push Mrs. Anderson any further. Principal Johnson scowled at the interruption. "We're fine," he snapped, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't as confident as he wanted to appear. Mrs. Harper didn't back down. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. "Because it seems like you're threatening her again. You've already put her in a difficult position. Maybe it's time to reconsider your approach." For a moment, there was silence. Principal Johnson and Mrs. Harper locked eyes, a battle of wills playing out in the tense air. Mrs. Anderson sat there, unsure of what to do, her heart racing. Finally, Principal Johnson stood up abruptly, clearly angry. "I've had enough of this," he muttered, turning toward the door. "We'll see how long your defiance lasts, Mrs. Anderson." As he stormed out of the office, Mrs. Anderson felt a mix of relief and fear. She had survived this encounter, but she knew the battle was far from over. Principal Johnson wasn't done with her yet. Mrs. Harper turned to Mrs. Anderson, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Mrs. Anderson nodded, but deep down, she knew that this fight was only just beginning. The storm that Principal Johnson was planning to unleash on her wasn't over. And now, with Mrs. Harper in her corner, she might have a chance to stand her ground. Suspense hook. As Principal Johnson storms off, Mrs. Anderson is left to wonder, what is his next move? And how far will he go to get rid of her? One thing is clear. She has to be ready for whatever comes next. The unexpected ally. The following day, Mrs. Anderson could feel the weight of the tension in the school. The air was thick with anticipation, and she knew Principal Johnson was only getting started with his attempts to push her out. But what worried her most was the nagging thought in the back of her mind. What was he capable of? She had expected a quiet morning, hoping to get through the day without any further confrontations. But when she walked into the teacher's lounge for her break, she was met with an unexpected sight. Mrs. Harper, the teacher who had stood up for her the day before, was waiting by the coffee machine, a cup of tea in her hands. "Hey, Mrs. Anderson," Mrs. Harper said, her voice calm but urgent. "We need to talk." Mrs. Anderson felt her heart race. Had things escalated even more? Was Johnson planning something else, something more dangerous? "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Harper glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "I heard some things. People are starting to take notice of what's happening with you and the principal. Word's spreading. Some of the staff are worried about you." Mrs. Anderson furrowed her brows. She hadn't expected anyone else to be concerned about her situation. "What do you mean?" "I'm not the only one who's noticed Johnson's behavior," Mrs. Harper continued, lowering her voice. "There are others in the school who are quietly supporting you. They just don't know how to speak up yet. But things are about to change." Mrs. Anderson was stunned. She had been feeling isolated, certain that it was just her against the entire administration. To hear that there were others who were willing to back her up was a small but powerful relief. "I can't do this alone," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and fear. "If this goes public, Johnson could make it even worse for me." Mrs. Harper looked around again, then leaned in closer. "I know someone who might be able to help. He's been following the situation, and he thinks Johnson's crossing the line. If we get him involved, he could help bring attention to what's really going on here." Mrs. Anderson was intrigued, but also hesitant. "Who is he? How can he help?" Mrs. Harper smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "His name is Officer Matthews. He's a police captain, and he's married to someone you know very well." At first, Mrs. Anderson didn't understand, but then it clicked. Officer Matthews was her husband's old friend, someone who had been a part of their lives for years. She hadn't thought about him much recently, but now she realized he could be the key to turning everything around. "Do you think he'll help?" Mrs. Anderson asked, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "If we get him involved, it could make things worse. But if we don't, Johnson will just keep pushing me until I have no choice but to quit." Mrs. Harper nodded firmly. "It's a risk, but it's one worth taking. Officer Matthews knows how to deal with situations like this. He understands the law, and he'll know what to do. If we bring him in, it'll send a message to Johnson that he can't keep getting away with this." For a moment, Mrs. Anderson felt overwhelmed. She had been fighting this battle alone, but now she realized she had an ally, a powerful one, on her side. Officer Matthews could help her take a stand against Principal Johnson, but she also knew that once they got involved, there would be no turning back. The stakes would be higher than ever. She looked at Mrs. Harper, her decision made. "Okay, let's do it. Let's talk to him." The two women exchanged a look of determination. Mrs. Anderson knew that the moment they involved Officer Matthews, everything would change. The game was no longer just about a teacher versus a principal. It was about something much bigger, and Mrs. Anderson was ready to fight for what was right. As Mrs. Anderson left the teacher's lounge, her mind raced. Could they really take on Principal Johnson and win? What would happen when Officer Matthews got involved? The uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog, but Mrs. Anderson knew one thing for sure. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Suspense hook. With Officer Matthews ready to help, the battle between Mrs. Anderson and Principal Johnson is about to escalate. What will happen when the law is involved? Will Johnson back down, or will his actions push him too far? Mrs. Anderson can't afford to wait any longer. Her career, her reputation, and her future at Cedarwood High are all on the line.